Hey, squirrels, time to read while I'm still somewhat with it. I go back and read the last paragraph. I think we're still on chapter 6. Of course, you'll see that. You will have already seen that in the title. Difficulty is, said Nash, to get hold of the letters. Either people put them in the fire or they won't admit to having received anything of the kind. Stupid, you see, and afraid of being mixed up with the police. They're a backward lot here. Still, we've got a fair amount to get on with, said Graves. Nash took the letter I had given him from his pocket and tossed it over to Graves. The latter glanced through it, laid it with the others, and observed approvingly, very nice indeed. It was not the way I should have chosen to describe the epistle in question, but experts, I suppose, have their own point of view. I was glad that that screed of vituperative. Let's look that up and see what that means. Not that. Up here. Up one. Okay. Bitter and abusive is what it means. Let's see if there's a pronunciation. Come on. Of course not, but it looks like vituperative. Vituperative. I think I just spelled that while ago, maybe. Bitter and abusive. Okay. That screed, S-C-R-E-E-D, of vituperative and obscene abuse gave somebody pleasure. We've got enough, I think, to go on with, said Inspector Graves, and I'll ask you gentlemen if you should get any more to bring them along at once. Also, if you hear of someone else getting one, you in particular, doctor, among your patients, do your best to get them to come along here with them. I've got, he sorted with deft fingers among his exhibits, one to Mr. Symington, received as far back as 2 months ago, one to Dr. Griffith, one to Miss Gench, one written to Mrs. Mudge, the butcher's wife, one to Jennifer Clark, barmaid at the Three Crowns, the one received by Mrs. Symington, this one now to Miss Burton, oh yes, and one from the bank manager. Quite a representative collection, I remarked, and not one I couldn't match from other cases. This one here is as near as nothing to one written by that milliner woman. This one is the dead spit of an outbreak we had up in Northumberton, written by a schoolgirl they were. I can tell you gentlemen, I'd like to see something new sometimes instead of the same old treadmill. There's nothing new under the sun, I murmured. Quite so, you'd know that if you were in our profession. Nash sighed and said, yes, indeed. Symington asked, have you come to any definite opinion as to the writer? Graves cleared his throat and delivered a small lecture. There are certain similarities shared by all these letters. I shall enumerate them, gentlemen, in case they suggest anything to your minds. The text of the letters is composed of words made up from individual letters cut out of a printed book. It's an old book, printed, I should say, about the year 1830. This has obviously been done to avoid the risk of recognition through handwriting, which is, as most people know nowadays, a fairly easy matter. The so-called disguising of a hand not amounting to much when faced with expert tests. There are no fingerprints on the letters and envelopes of a distinctive character. That is to say, they've been handled by the postal authorities, the recipient, and there are other stray fingerprints, but no set common to all, showing, therefore, that the person who put them together was careful to wear gloves. The envelopes were typewritten by a Windsor 7 machine, well worn with the A and the T out of alignment. Most of them have been posted locally or put in a box of a house by hand. It is therefore evident that they are of local provenance. They were written by a woman, and in my opinion, a woman of middle age or over, and probably, though not certainly, unmarried. We maintained a respectful silence for a minute or two, then I said, "The typewriter's your best bet, isn't it? That oughtn't be difficult in a little place like this." Inspector Graves shook his head sadly and said, "Something to drink. You ever need to swallow, but you can't swallow? Sometimes when it takes me a minute, that's what happens. It's like you can't swallow. Weird." That's where you're wrong. "The typewriter," said Superintendent Nash, "is unfortunately too easy. It's an old one from Mr. Symington's office, given by him to the Women's Institute, where, I may say, it's fairly easy of access. The ladies here all often go into the Institute. Can't you tell something definite from the touch, don't you call it?" Again Graves nodded. "Yes." "That can be done, but these envelopes have all been typed by someone using one finger." "Someone, then, unused to the typewriter?" "No, I wouldn't say that. Someone, say, who can type but doesn't want us to know the fact. Whoever writes these things has been very cunning," I said slowly. "She is, sir, she is," said Graves, "up to every trick of the trade. I shouldn't have thought one of these bucolic women down here would have had the brains," I said. Graves coughed. I haven't made myself plain, I'm afraid. Those letters were written by an educated woman." "What? By a lady?" The word slipped out involuntarily. I hadn't used the term lady for years, but now it came automatically to my lips, re-echoed from days long ago, and my grandmother's faint, unconsciously arrogant voice saying, "Of course she isn't a lady, dear." Nash understood at once. The word lady still meant something to him. "Not necessarily a lady," he said, "but certainly not a village woman. They're mostly pretty illiterate down here, can't spell, and certainly can't express themselves with fluency." I was silent, for I'd had a shock. The community was so small. Unconsciously, I had visualized the writer of the letters as a Mrs. Cleet or her like, some spiteful, cunning half-wit. Symington put my thoughts into words. He said sharply, "But that narrows it down to about half a dozen to a dozen people in the whole place." "That's right. I can't believe it." Then, with a slight effort and looking straight in front of him, as though the mere sound of his own words were distasteful, he said, "You have heard what I stated at the inquest, in case you may have thought that statement was actuated by a desire to protect my wife's memory. I should like to repeat now that I'm firmly convinced that the subject matter of the letter my wife received was absolutely false. I know it was false. My wife was a very sensitive woman in her, well, you might call it prudish in some respects. Such a letter would have been a great shock to her, and she was in poor health. Graves responded instantly, "That's quite likely to be right, sir. None of these letters shows any signs of intimate knowledge. They're just blind accusations. There's been no attempt to blackmail, and there doesn't seem to be any religious bias, such as we sometimes get. It's just sex and spite. And that's going to give us quite a good pointer towards the writer." Symington got up, dry and emotional as the man was. His lips were trembling. "I hope you find the devil who writes these soon. She murdered my wife as surely as she'd put a knife into her." He paused. "How does she feel now, I wonder?" He went out, leaving that question unanswered. "How does she feel, Griffith?" I asked. It seemed to me the answer was in his province. "God knows, remorseful perhaps. On the other hand, it may be that she's enjoying her power. Mrs. Symington's death may have fed her mania." "I hope not," I said with a slight shiver, "because if so, she'll—" I hesitated, and Nash finished the sentence for me. "She'll try it again?" "That, Mr. Burton, would be the best thing that could happen for us. The pitcher goes to the well once too often, remember." "She'll be mad to go on with it," I exclaimed. "She'll go on," said Graves. "They always do. It's a vice, you know. They can't let it alone." I shook my head with a shudder. I asked if they needed me any longer. I wanted to get out into the air. The atmosphere seemed tinged with evil. "There's nothing more, Mr. Burton," said Nash. "Only keep your eyes open. Do as much propaganda as you can. That is to say, urge on everyone that they've got to report any letter they receive." I nodded. "I should think everyone in the place has had one of the foul things by now," I said. "I wonder," said Graves. He put his sad head a little on one side and asked, "You don't know definitely of anyone who hasn't had a letter?" What an extraordinary question. The population at large isn't likely to take me into their confidence. No, Mr. Burton, I didn't mean that. I just wondered if you knew of any one person who quite definitely, to your certain knowledge, has not received an anonymous letter. Well, as a matter of fact, I hesitated. I do, in a way. And I repeated my conversation with Emily Barton and what she had said. Graves hesitated. Wait a minute. And repeated my conversation with Emily Barton and what she had said. Graves received the information with a wooden face and said, "Well, that may come in useful. I'll note it down." I went out into the afternoon sunshine with Owen Griffith. Once in the street, I swore aloud. What kind of place is this for a man to come to lie in the sun and heal his wounds? It's full of festering poison. This back. What? Come and lie in the sun and heal his wounds. It's full of festering poison. This place, and it looks as peaceful and as innocent as the Garden of Eden. Where'd I get what I said? Even there, said Owen dryly, there was one serpent. Look here, Griffith. Do they know anything? Have they got any idea? I don't know. They've got a wonderful technique, the police. They're seemingly so frank, but they tell you nothing. Yes, Nash is a nice fellow and a very capable one. If anyone's batty in this place, you ought to know it, I said accusingly. Griffith shook his head. He looked discouraged, but he looked more than that. He looked worried. I wondered if he had an inkling of some kind. We had been walking along the high street. Oh, Lord, I gotta get me glasses. I stopped at the door of the house agents. I believe my second installment of rent is due in advance. I've got a good mind to pay it and clear out with Joanna's right away. Forfeit the rest of the tenancy. Don't go, said Owen. Why not? He didn't answer. He said slowly after a minute or two. After all, I dare say you're right. Limstock isn't healthy. Isn't healthy just now. It might harm you or your sister. Nothing harms Joanna, I said. She's tough. I'm the weakly one. Somehow this business makes me sick. It makes me sick, said Owen. I pushed the door of the house agents half open. But I shan't go, I said. Vulgar curiosity is stronger than pusillanimity. I want to know the solution. I went in. A woman who was typing got up and came towards me. She had frizzy hair and simpered, but I found her more intelligent than the speckled youth who had previously held sway in the outer office. A minute or two later, something familiar about her penetrated through to my unconsciousness. It was Miss Ginch. Later, Symington's lady clerk. I commented on the fact. You were with Gilbraith and Symington, weren't you? I said. Yes, indeed, but I thought it was better to leave. That's a good... Let's see. To leave. This is quite a good post, though not quite so well paid, but there are things that are more valuable than money, don't you think so? Undoubtedly, I said. Those awful letters, breathed Miss Ginch to a sibilant whisper. I got a dreadful one about me and Mr. Symington. Oh, terrible it was, saying the most awful things. I know... see... awful things. I knew my duty and I took it to the police, though of course it wasn't exactly pleasant for me, was it? No, most unpleasant, but they thanked me and said I had done quite right. But I felt that after that, if people were talking, and evidently they must have been, or where did the writer get the idea from, then I must avoid even the appearance of evil, though there must have been anything at all. Must avoid even the appearance of evil, though there has never been anything at all wrong between me and Mr. Symington. I felt rather embarrassed. No, of course not. But people have such evil minds. Yes, alas, such evil minds. Nervously, trying to avoid it, I nevertheless met her eye and made a most unpleasant discovery. Miss Ginch was thoroughly enjoying herself. Already once today I had come across someone who reacted pleasurably to anonymous letters. Inspector Graves' enthusiasm was professional. Miss Ginch's employment I found merely suggestive and disgusting. An idea flashed across my startled mind. Had Miss Ginch written these letters herself? Finally, the end of chapter 6. If you can hear my stomach, the pterodactyls are making noises. Okay, so hopefully we'll get to 7 tomorrow. Hopefully it doesn't have 1,000,000 parts. But whatever. Love y'all. Be sweet, don't be ugly. I'll see you on the YT Street saying 3 bells tomorrow and Sunday. Yep, even on Mother's Day. Don't have any special plans. My youngest daughter, Hannah, the one that lives 30 minutes away, she invited me to lunch tomorrow, but it's supposed to be rainy, and I've had this ick, and so I said, well, we'll just do something next week. So we're on for next Tuesday. Love y'all, and y'all have, if I don't see you before then, a happy Mother's Day. Be sweet, don't be ugly. Bye-bye.